Welcome to the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. The Invisible Wheelchair Podcast was selected by FeedSpot as one of the top 10 obsessive compulsive disorder podcasts. I'm Donald Grodoff, EFT tapping practitioner and OCD coach at FamilyOCD.com. On the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast, I focus on the hidden world of OCD and anxiety with interviews and information around this topic. My purpose is to bring about awareness of OCD, those who treat OCD, and of course, those who suffer with OCD. Obsessive-compulsive disorder is a treatable and manageable disorder. In my practice at FamilyOCD.com, I guide people through the process of ERP therapy and other alternative treatments. If you know of someone suffering with OCD, simply visit FamilyOCD.com. If you or someone you know suffers or has suffered and recovered from OCD and would like to get their story out, simply contact us through www.invisiblewheelchair.com. We want to talk to you and get your story out on the podcast. Know that the ideas and thoughts presented here are not necessarily those of Family OCD, Invisible Wheelchair Podcast, or Donald Grodoff. We also ask you to take just a few moments and leave comments at www.invisiblewheelchair.com. Those comments help us to know what the next topic should be, and we really want to hear from you. Now, let's get to that podcast. This podcast was recorded February 12th, 2021. This is podcast number 53, Myths of OCD. Oh, I'm just a little OCD. So today I want to talk about some of the myths of OCD. And these have been around for a while, but there's a couple ones I think are a little bit newer that I want to talk about also. But I call it that title, Oh, I'm just a little OCD, because that is part of the myth thing that goes on. I can remember hearing that when we were going through the worst of it. Hearing somebody say that would just drive me up a wall. You know, somebody would say, or I would say something about how neat their room was or their desk was or something like that, and they would say, oh, that's just my OCD and organizing it and making it neat, you know. And it would just flare me up because they didn't have a concept of what OCD was really like. And we were going through, at the time especially, some really horrific times, violent and anger and battles and all kinds of stuff. So they just didn't get it, but they thought they did. They thought they knew what OCD was. So these myths are some of that factor. And I wanted to start out with, the first one I wanted to start out with is kind of a new one, and I see it as a myth. Now these are some that I found through the IOCDF, the International Foundation for OCD. And some of these are ones that I have kind of seen and developed and saw for myself. So it's kind of a mix in there because they don't have some of these on that list. But the one that I see as the newest is got to do with what we're going through right now in 2020 and 2021 is the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic. It's this idea, and it shocked me when I heard it. I think I heard it on the radio actually, that somebody said, oh, this must be easy for somebody with OCD because they're already washing their hands a lot, keeping them clean. Because, of course, with this pandemic, one of the big things was talking about cleaning hands and making sure you're doing it for a good amount of time. And it varied somewhat, but I think it was 20 seconds is really all you're supposed to be doing it for. But there were even some out there saying 20 minutes, which is... Anyway, so people were saying this must be easy for OCD people to deal with because of that cleaning. And in reality, it was just the opposite. It was very difficult because those that had been through it, like my daughter and my two kids, my two daughters going through it, the it actually kind of flared a little bit of that up for them. In some cases, a lot for them. So no, it wasn't easier for somebody with OCD. So that to me is a myth that any kind of pandemic where you have to keep yourself clean is going to be easier for somebody with obsessive compulsive disorder is not true. Of course, I think one of the number one myths out there is organization, believing that a person that has OCD is very organized and it's about the OCD that they're organized, and that's not true at all. Of course, throughout all of these, I can repeat the same thing. OCD is an anxiety driven disorder. So it's not really about the things more as it is about the panic, the anxiety, all of that. So organization, just keeping things neat and all, it's a trait of it or a symptom of it or a compulsion of it, but it is not what OCD is. The second biggest one, I think, is, of course, cleanliness. Thinking that OCD is just about hand washing. And it's not. Even in our case, hand washing was one of the compulsions. Showering was. So cleanliness as far as hands and body were a big thing. But as far as cleanliness elsewhere, no. Rooms were not kept organized, dust free, clear, dust bunny clear, all of that. It wasn't about cleanliness. It was about so much panic that they believed that if they washed their hands, it would ease the repetitive thoughts that went through it. Some people believe, as a myth, that there's a test that'll tell you that you have OCD, like a blood test or some kind of physical test that will tell you. Now, there are tests out there that will give you an indication, and I happen to have a link to one on my family OCD site, and probably by the time you get this up there, I'll probably have it on the invisiblewheelchair.com website. So familyocd.com has it on there, and so does the invisiblewheelchair.com. But there really aren't tests. What happens is that a doctor or a therapist will have the indications from things that patterns or behaviors or things that the person does that will indicate that OCD, and they'll make their best judgment or call on it. And they can look at different testing, like for instance, when my daughter went through it, and I've seen other clients go through this, they've done some like food allergy testing and enzymes and DNA and different things like that that they'll look at. And I'm saying these things, but it's internal tests that they can do where they can see imbalances and foods that they're allergic to that have some trigger effect, that have some anxiety effect that could be causing it, that could tell them that there's a problem. Things like GABA, which are low or high, can be an indication that there's might be OCD going on. So there are testing, but it's not direct testing on OCD blood work that'll say yes, you have OCD, no, you don't. It's just these different judgments and observations and other types of tests that can do that. Another big one is OCD is not treatable. Now, OCD is not what I would say curable necessarily. I think it's something that's pretty much with you for your life, but it is manageable, and you can live a regular life, a fairly normal life. The next one is women, that women are more highly affected by OCD than men are. And I found kind of a little bit of a different story here, but that women do tend to have a slight advantage from what I've seen on the research from the foundation. But research says there's no difference between gender, race, ethnicity, economic status, things like that. So I think that one is really still a myth that women are more highly. They are slightly more, but it's the percentage is very low even on the foundations. The fact that it's rare in kids is a myth because actually the latest statistics, I just saw these from 20. They're up to date. They had done these statistics from the Anxiety and Depression Association, marked as 2021 already. So, and it's 1 in 100 children face or have OCD. And to be honest with you, I think that might be a little higher than or lower than what it is, because I think the problem with OCD and some of these other disorders is that they're just not diagnosed. They go through life with it, but they don't know it or haven't explored it. The parents haven't explored it. 1 in 40 adults have OCD. And another myth is that it's about childhood, that it doesn't affect childhood, or it does affect it. It kind of goes both ways. But it's really not so much about childhood. It's not about that. But you can have genetic and family genetics that cause it to be in multiple people in a family. They usually say it's just one, and then you'd have a second one, and that's what we've had. So it does kind of run in families. Another myth is that stress causes OCD, and I find that it's a chicken or egg kind of conversation. Which comes first? What I tend to find and what I tend to see in the people I work with and in my own personal case, my own family's case, is that as anxiety grows, OCD tends to come in when it hits a certain level. And I see that and the other part of that is that it is part of more than just, it usually has within it, and I think this is another myth, is that it has within it or part of it other disorders like ADHD or PTSD. Again, because it's all based around anxiety. So obviously, when anxiety gets high, it's going to be something that will kick in. So I've always said it's kind of a subset of those other disorders, especially high anxiety disorders. Another myth is that OCD people are weird or crazy. And they're not, absolutely not. I believe they feel like they're a bit crazy or they're going crazy if they don't know what it is, especially when they first get it or when they're doing it and they have no diagnosis to it or no knowledge of what's really it is. They'll feel like they're going crazy because it takes over your life. So they'll feel crazy, but they aren't crazy. In fact, what I have found with a lot of these disorders, especially OCD, is the kids that are and the people that are dealing with OCD are highly intelligent. It's almost like they're on a different plane or level in a way. And so, and that leads to another myth that you basically can get over it because you're smart enough. You should be able to get over this. That's one of the things I find with parents a lot of times with OCD, with anxiety disorders. One of the two parents will believe that it's really nothing, and that it's behavior, or that these kids are smart enough, they should be able to just get over it. They're really smart enough. And what I and I just did a talk on shoot on parent on the parent, or the father, I should say. And a lot of times I see this, and I don't necessarily just all on fathers. It can be on both parents, but I find it a little heavier on the father side, as far as believing that not really believing that there's anything mental going on, that it's just the child just being obnoxious, or uh, something like that. When in reality, what I really try to get across to the parents is that there is something going on in the brain that is not right. It's not working well. It's looping and causing these messages and causing this anxiety, and to be that it's real, and to believe that it's real and handle it like it's real, not like they could just get over it. Because if you didn't really know it, 25% of families uh, have a second child that has OCD, and we talked about that inheritance thing of heredity. Uh, and what's interesting is 90% of the people that have OCD also have another mental illness, and that 75% of those with PTSD and panic disorders deal with OCD. 63% of mood disorders like bipolar are dealing with OCD too. 55, over half of those that are diagnosed with ADHD have OCD. And they're going with ADHD, I believe that's really an anxiety disorder. It's really about anxiety that's causing the mind to be blocked, big parts of the brain being shut down, so you can't think straight. So, of course, it's going to be attention deficit. And then, of course, even those with substance abuse, 38% of them are dealing with OCD. And what's interesting about ERP, the exposure response prevention therapy, which is the gold standard, the best way of getting past OCD, from the way I understand it, from what I've read, that ERP was first really developed for substance abuse. And so I find it fascinating that these same people are dealing with OCD, because I think they're really pretty related, the two. So the last myth: everyone has a little OCD, and I don't follow that belief. Now, I do really think there is a spectrum of OCD, of severity of it. And of course, there is a lot of variations of types of OCD. And I think I've talked about this before, as far as types of OCD. I love that we're defining them more: pure O's, the harm OCD, the sexuality OCD. It's getting pretty broad, the amount of definitions we've put to different types of OCD. And I think that's fine. What I kind of believe, though, is that OCD is OCD. It's just how it formulates itself. In the basic part of OCD is really structured the same. Obsessive thoughts causing compulsions and causing anxiety and being an anxiety disorder. So I don't think that it's so much about the definition of it, because the other part about that, I think, is that OCD tends to morph and change, and you get past one part of it. You might get past harm OCD, and sexual OCD comes up. So I like that we've defined them. I just don't. I think we got to think about the real core of it. Is it's still OCD. It's about anxiety, It's just how it shows up, and that morphs and changes and morphs and changes. It's a tough battle. So, those are kind of the list of the myths that I see out there that I found in research, but also came up with from what I've seen in the work I've done. And what I'm hoping that through understanding these myths, that there will be an understanding, that there will be education for some people to understand what's true and what's not about OCD. OCD is a devastating disorder. It takes over your life. I'm not sure if it'll be this month that this podcast will be on. I don't think it is, but it might be. I just did a interview for my stories from the OCD side, talking to somebody that is dealing with OCD, and he talked about what I also talk about, is how much it takes over your life and how much it just makes your life fold up. So to say it's just a little OCD, or I'm just so OCD, or something like that, is really hurtful and I don't know if I'd say spiteful, but can be really hurt somebody that has OCD, because they have no idea how much it is affecting their lives and how much it affected our lives. We closed our life down. So education and letting people know the truths and the untruths about it really helps them to understand it better, for them to understand that there truly is something going on in the brain, and that it's not just a matter of getting over it or that you're going crazy. It can be treated and it can be manageable. I don't know if I can say that it's curable, but many people, including my own family, are living a fairly normal life even though they have OCD. So I hope in some way this helps you that are listening to this, and I hope that you pass it along to somebody that doesn't believe that their child has OCD or doesn't believe they have OCD. Let them know some of the myths, some of the reality of it. Listen to the other parts of the podcast too at invisiblewheelchair.com or on iTunes or Spotify or Amazon. There's a gazillion places to find it. I hope that you will also go to invisiblewheelchair.com and leave a comment for me. It helps me to come up with more of these podcasts that can be more educational, more on point. So help me out there if you would. Again, it's invisiblewheelchair.com. So thank you, and I hope this was helpful for you. This concludes this podcast. We really would appreciate your comments. Simply leave a comment at www.invisiblewheelchair.com. There, you're able to submit a comment that will help us determine future podcasts. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the podcast, please email Don at invisiblewheelchair.com. Remember, there is a corresponding tapping recording for each of the podcasts, with the exception of the interview podcast. You can find these tapping recordings and archive past podcasts at www.invisiblewheelchair.com. Finally, there is relief for OCD, and we at FamilyOCD.com and FocusedHealthyFamily.com can help you find that relief. Again, you can contact us through those sites, FamilyOCD.com or FocusedHealthyFamily.com. You can also find us on Facebook at Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at InvisibleWheel1, that's the number 1, or at FamilyOCD. So thank you for listening. Keep tapping and transcending your life to new heights.